We were meant to be escaping everything, just two friends, a weekend of hunting, no phones, no pressure. Reed had convinced me to go, saying it would be an amazing adventure, and for some reason I trusted him. I didn't hesitate when he said the desert in Utah was the ideal place. Sure, I'd heard some tales, but it was just a desert, right? Nothing more than sand, rocks, and the occasional lizard, or so I thought. The drive out had been pretty uneventful. Reed singing off-key to his awful playlist while I watched the scenery shift from civilization to absolute nothingness. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun was halfway down, casting strange, long shadows across the sand. Everything looked stretched out, almost like the desert was yawning, ready to devour us. We started setting up camp, Reed cracking jokes about the so-called Skinwalker the gas station clerk had warned us about. I remember the serious look on the guy's face, like he was trying to scare us off. Reed just laughed it off, but for some reason, it stuck with me. I didn't really believe in desert monsters, but the way that guy spoke made my stomach uneasy. Once the fire was going, night had fully fallen. It wasn't just dark, it was pitch black. The kind of dark where you can't see anything beyond the campfire's light. The wind picked up, whistling through the rocks, and it almost sounded like voices. I tried to ignore it, but every so often, I heard a whisper, just a flicker of sound that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Reed kept talking, laughing off everything, but I could see him glancing around, his eyes darting to the shadows just outside the firelight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. It was hard to explain, but it felt like the darkness wasn't just empty. It felt heavy, like it was pressing in on us. The temperature dropped quickly. One moment, I was fine, and the next, I was shivering, my breath coming out in clouds of mist. I pulled my jacket tighter, my eyes scanning the rocks again. They looked different now, twisted and wrong, almost like they were moving. I blinked, trying to clear my mind, but it didn't help. Everything just felt off. Reed fell silent, poking at the fire, and that's when I heard it, a rustling sound. It was too deliberate to be the wind. I jerked my head up, and for just a second, I saw something movement low to the ground. It was quick, gone before I could focus on it, but my heart started racing. I glanced at Reed, but he just shrugged, muttering something about jackrabbits. I wanted to believe him, but I knew it wasn't a rabbit. The night dragged on, each second feeling longer than the last. The fire crackled, the wind whispered, and that feeling, like we weren't alone, never left. It seemed like something was watching us from the darkness, waiting. The worst part was, I think Reed felt it too, but he wouldn't say it. We'd come out here to escape everything. But now, all I wanted was to get away from whatever was lurking in the dark. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it again, the rustling sound only louder this time. I froze, my eyes straining to see beyond the firelight. Reed had dozed off, his head resting awkwardly on his backpack. For a moment, I almost woke him up, but then I thought, what if it's just an animal? There was no reason to freak him out if it was nothing. I leaned forward, squinting into the dark. The wind had died down, leaving the desert strangely quiet. That's when I saw it. A shadow moving low to the ground between the rocks. It was fast, almost too fast, and it was coming closer. My heart started pounding, my stomach twisting. I tried to tell myself it was just a coyote or something, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Reed, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I nudged him with my foot. His eyes fluttered open, annoyed. What? He muttered, rubbing his eyes. Sure, there's something out there. Reed sat up, squinting into the dark. You're kidding, right? He said, his voice thick with skepticism. But then he saw the look on my face, and his expression changed. Slowly, he turned his head, scanning the rocks around us. For a moment, There was nothing, just the crackle of the fire and the chill of the night air. Then we both saw it, a figure standing at the crest of a hill. I felt my breath catch in my chest. It looked like a person, but something was off. Stood too still, like it was frozen in place. And then Reed gasped. That's me," he whispered. I stared at the figure, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wore Reed's jacket and had the same build, the same stance. It was like looking at a reflection, only it wasn't moving. It just stood there watching us. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mouth went dry. I glanced at Reed, and I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear I felt. "We need to go," I whispered. Reed nodded, pale as a ghost. We scrambled to our feet, grabbing whatever we could. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the flashlight. The figure on the hill still didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on us, watching, waiting. As we started backing away, I heard something, a laugh. At first, it was soft, like the wind, but then it grew louder, echoing across the desert. My blood turned to ice. It was Reed's laugh, but twisted, mocking. I looked at Reed, and he shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "That's not me," he whispered, his voice trembling. Panic set in, and we turned, running toward the truck. The sand was loose beneath our feet, making every step harder. Behind us, the laughter grew louder, followed by the sound of something moving, something fast. I glanced over my shoulder, and my heart nearly stopped. The figure was gone, but there was something else now, a shape darting between the rocks, its eyes glowing in the dark. "Run!" Reed shouted. I didn't need to be told twice. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I kept running. The truck finally came into view, and I fumbled with the door, my fingers numb from fear. Reed was already in the driver's seat, and as soon as I got in, he slammed his foot on the gas. The headlights flicked on, and for a split second, I saw it. Half coyote, half something else, its body twisted, its eyes locked on mine. Then Reed hit the gas, and we were speeding away. The desert blurred around us, the laughter fading into the distance, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there, watching, waiting. As we drove, all I could think was that we should have listened to the warnings. We never should have come to the desert. Reed kept the truck's pedal to the floor, bouncing over the rough terrain. Each jolt made me clench my teeth. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing right behind us. My heart pounded like it was going to explode. The headlights cut through the darkness, but it felt like the desert went on forever. No matter how far we drove, it felt like we weren't getting any closer to safety. "Are we even going the right way?" I asked, my voice shaky. Reed didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the road, if you could even call it a road. It was just sand, rocks, and a few scraggly bushes. His knuckles were white on the wheel, his jaw clenched. I could tell he was scared, maybe more than I was. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I think so." The truck hit a deep dip, and I almost hit my head on the roof. I groaned, clutching the door handle to steady myself. I glanced out the window, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving alongside us. My breath caught, and I squinted, trying to make it out. It was just shadows, I told myself. Just the desert playing tricks on me. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Reed must have seen it too because he swerved, the tires skidding on the loose sand. "Did you see that?" he shouted, his voice cracking. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to admit that, yeah, I'd seen it, something keeping pace with us, something that shouldn't have been able to move that fast. The truck fishtailed, and for a moment I thought we were going to flip, but Reed managed to get it under control, and we kept going, the engine roaring as he pushed it to the limit. My hands were shaking, my fingers numb as I gripped the dashboard. The laughter had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. It felt like the desert was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a mistake. Suddenly, the truck's headlights caught something ahead, something standing right in our path. Reed cursed under his breath and slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop just a few feet from the figure. My heart stopped. It was the same twisted figure we'd seen before, Reed's twisted reflection, staring at us with those empty eyes. "What do we do?" I whispered, barely able to speak. Reed didn't answer. He just stared at it, his face pale, his eyes wide. The figure took a step toward us, its movements jerky, unnatural. My stomach twisted, and panic rose in my chest. We had to leave. We couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever that thing was to reach us. "Go!" I shouted. Reed snapped out of it, fumbling with the gear shift. He hit the gas, and the truck lurched forward, swerving around the figure. I kept my eyes on it as we passed, and for a moment, I saw it smile. A horrible, twisted grin that made my skin crawl. Then it was gone, swallowed up by the darkness, and we were speeding away again. My hands were trembling, my heart racing. I looked at Reed and he looked at me. We didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. We just had to get out of there, far away from the desert. We never went back to that spot again. Be careful if you ever find yourself in the Utah desert. You never know what might be watching. We were all having a great time. Lily, Ethan, Noah, Hannah, Alex, and me. The sky was clear, the canyon was massive and beautiful, and it felt like we were on top of the world. We had all our ropes and gear, ready to face whatever nature threw at us. At first, everything was filled with laughter and jokes, like we were invincible. We were rappelling down rocky ledges, our voices echoing, and I remember thinking this is exactly what I needed. A break from the stress back home, just us and nature. Then, everything changed. It happened so quickly. One moment we were climbing down, and the next, the ground started shaking. It wasn't just a small tremor. It felt like the earth was falling apart. I heard someone shout, and suddenly, rocks were tumbling all around us like a nightmare. Dust filled the air, and I couldn't see anything. My heart was in my throat, my hands clinging to the canyon wall as I searched for cover. When the dust settled, we were all coughing, trying to figure out what just happened. We looked back the way we came, and it was like our exit had disappeared, buried under tons of rock. A cold dread seeped into me, like ice in my veins. There was no way out, we were trapped. Ethan, always the calm one, tried to reassure us that we'd find another way, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He was as scared as the rest of us. We decided to set up camp since the sun was already dipping behind the canyon walls. It got dark so quickly, faster than I expected. The shadows stretched out, and I swear they seemed to be getting closer, like they had a life of their own. We built a fire, trying to keep the darkness at bay, but it didn't help much. It only made the shadows dance on the canyon walls, making everything feel even more eerie. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like someone or something was watching us from the darkness. Ethan said he was going to scout ahead to see if he could find another way out. I didn't like the idea of him going alone, but he was always the brave one, the one who knew what to do, so we let him go. The rest of us waited, and the silence was unbearable. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead silent, like the whole canyon was holding its breath. I hugged my sleeping bag tighter, trying not to think about what could be out there. Every little sound made me jump, the wind, the crackle of the fire, even my own breathing. Then we heard it, a voice calling our names. At first, I thought it was Ethan coming back, but something about it didn't sound right. It echoed strangely, like it was bouncing around too much, stretching in ways it shouldn't. It made my skin crawl, and I could see Hannah's eyes go wide, like she felt it too. We all stared into the dark, straining to see something, anything. Then Ethan came back, or at least it looked like him. But the moment I saw him, I knew something was off. He moved awkwardly, his joints stiff, and his eyes were empty, like he wasn't really seeing us. He said he'd found a way out, but his voice was all wrong, flat and emotionless. It didn't sound like Ethan at all. I felt my stomach drop, fear rising in my chest. I wanted to scream, to tell the others that this wasn't Ethan, that we needed to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. Hannah grabbed my hand, her fingers digging into my skin. I think she knew too. We just stood there, staring at him. At it, the fire crackled between us, and for a moment, I thought I saw something beneath Ethan's skin. Something dark and shifting, like it was trying to break free. My heart was pounding, and I knew, without a doubt, that whatever this thing was, it wasn't our friend. It was something else, something that wanted us to follow it, and I knew if we did, we'd never make it out of that canyon. We stood there, frozen, staring at whatever had taken Ethan's place. My mind was racing, and I could feel my knees trembling. I mean, it looked like Ethan, sort of, but the more I looked, the more I realized it was all wrong. His smile was too wide, his eyes too dull, and he just stood there like he was waiting for us to make a move. I couldn't help but think, this isn't real, this isn't happening. But it was, and it was terrifying. Noah spoke first, his voice shaky. "Ethan, you okay, man?" He took a step forward, but I grabbed his arm before he could get too close. I didn't want any of us getting near whatever that was. The thing pretending to be Ethan turned its head toward Noah, but it was such a jerky movement, like it wasn't used to having a neck. It said something about finding a way out, but the words felt empty, like they were just noises it had learned to repeat. Hannah squeezed my hand again, and I could tell she was as freaked out as I was. I wanted to tell her everything would be okay, but I didn't believe it myself. My mouth was dry, I could barely swallow. I glanced at Alex, who looked like he was about to bolt at any second, his eyes darting between the thing and the darkness behind us. We all knew we needed to do something, but none of us had a clue what. Running seemed like a bad idea, but staying put wasn't any better. The fire crackled, and the thing took a step closer, like it was testing us, seeing how we'd react. My whole body tensed, and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. Noah took a step back, and I saw the fear in his eyes. I think we all realized right then that this thing wasn't going to leave us alone. It wanted something, and it wasn't just trying to help us find a way out. "We need to move," I whispered, barely loud enough for Hannah and Alex to hear. I wasn't even sure where we should go, but I knew we couldn't just stand there waiting for whatever this was to make the next move. Hannah nodded, her eyes wide, and Alex swallowed hard, glancing around like he was trying to find an escape route. Noah turned to us, his face pale, and mouthed, "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer, but I remembered the narrow crevice we'd passed earlier, the one that looked like it barely had enough room for us to squeeze through. It wasn't much, but it was something. I leaned in close to the others, keeping my eyes on the thing that looked like Ethan. "The crevice," I whispered. "We need to get to the crevice." Hannah's eyes widened even more, but she nodded. I could feel her trembling next to me, and I knew she was just as scared as I was. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. We had to do this. We had to move, and we had to do it now. I gave Alex a nudge, and he nodded, his face set in determination, even though I could see the fear there too. Noah started inching back toward us, and that's when the thing moved again. It was like it suddenly realized we were trying to leave. It lunged forward, its limbs jerking awkwardly, and that was it. My heart leapt into my throat, and I turned, pulling Hannah with me. "Run!" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. We sprinted toward the crevice, our feet pounding against the rocky ground. I could hear the thing behind us, its movements strange and unnatural, like it was trying to remember how to be human. The shadows seemed to close in, and my chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I reached the crevice first, throwing myself into the narrow gap. The stones scraped against my skin, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. Hannah was right behind me, then Noah, then Alex. I could hear the thing, whatever it was, making this awful guttural noise, like it was frustrated that I didn't dare look back. I just kept pushing forward, squeezing through the narrow space, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. All I could think was that we had to make it. We had to get out of this canyon before it caught us. We finally made it through the crevice, but it didn't feel like much of a victory. My hands were scraped raw, and I could barely catch my breath. I collapsed against the canyon wall, trying to pull myself together. The others squeezed out one by one, each of them looking just as shaken as I felt. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on us, making it impossible to think clearly. I could still hear that awful noise behind us, echoing off the rocks. "Is everyone okay?" I asked, my voice shaky. It was a stupid question. We were obviously not okay, but I had to ask. I needed to know we were still all here. Hannah nodded, her face pale, and Noah gave me a thumbs up, though he looked like he was about to collapse. Alex just stared at the crevice, his eyes wide with disbelief. I didn't know what to say next. I didn't know what had happened to Ethan or why that thing had come after us. All I knew was that we needed to get out, fast. We didn't stop running, not even when we heard the thing's voice again, calling our names from somewhere in the dark. We just kept moving with the echoes of the canyon and whatever was in it, chasing us all the way. I wish I could tell you that Emily and I weren't warned, but we totally were. Every local we met gave us that look. The kind that says, "You're making a huge mistake." The old man at the gas station even muttered something about strange happenings and people going missing around here. Emily just rolled her eyes, and I probably laughed it off too. We were seasoned hikers, after all, and we'd done this countless times. We weren't about to let some eerie campfire stories ruin our trip. So, there we were, trudging deeper into the forest, our packs heavy on our backs, the trees closing in like some massive ancient wall. The farther we went, the more the air seemed to change. It felt thick, like something unseen was lingering in it. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing, but the deeper we went, the quieter everything got. No birds, no breeze, not even the rustling of leaves. Just the sound of our boots crunching on the ground and our breaths, heavy and forced, though we pretended they weren't from nerves. By the time we found a clearing, the sun was sinking, casting a weird orange glow through the branches. It was the perfect spot, though, with the moonlight already creeping in, creating just enough space for our little campfire. We set up camp, lit the fire, and soon enough we were laughing again, trying to shake off the odd vibes from earlier. Emily popped open some snacks, and we joked about the creepy stories we'd heard, acting like they weren't bothering us. But there was this tight knot in my chest that wouldn't go away. I don't know when it happened, but at some point, the fire stopped feeling like enough. The light didn't stretch as far as it should have, and beyond its glow, the world seemed pitch black, as if the darkness was swallowing everything whole. Emily was in the middle of telling a funny story about a disastrous hiking date when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but no. There was someone or something standing at the edge of the clearing. My heart skipped a beat, and I swear my stomach dropped. I couldn't see much, just a figure half hidden in the shadows, but it was staring right at us. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but when Emily noticed my silence, she turned, and her laughter stopped instantly. Standing at the tree line was Emily, or at least something that looked like her. Same red beanie, same ripped jeans, but its posture was wrong. Too stiff, too unnatural, like it was trying to imitate being human. And the way its eyes reflected the firelight, There was something off. Empty. Hollow. It made my skin crawl. Then it spoke, or tried to. It was Emily's voice, but distorted, like an old tape being played too slowly. "Jake, come here," it said, stretching out the words in a creepy, unnatural way. I froze. I couldn't move. Emily, the real Emily, grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into me. She whispered, terrified, "That's not me, Jake. We need to leave now." That's when the figure stepped forward, its face shifting, like the skin didn't quite fit, like it was wearing her face but in a wrong way. Everything after that happened in a blur. Instinct kicked in and we were running, leaving the fire, the gear, everything behind. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it, whatever it was, crashing through the woods behind us, like it couldn't decide if it was human or something else. The worst part? It kept calling my name, switching between Emily's voice and a guttural, snarly sound, like a mix of a growl and a plea. Running through the woods at night, probably the worst idea ever. Every branch seemed to reach out to grab me, and the ground was a mess of roots, just waiting to trip me. Emily was just ahead, her red beanie bobbing in the darkness like a lifeline, and I focused on it, terrified of losing her, terrified of being alone out there with whatever that thing was. My lungs burned, my breath ragged and shallow, but still, I kept running. I could hear it behind us. Fast, too fast. Each time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw it, just for a moment. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, its face warped like it was struggling to remember how to look human, and those eyes dark, empty pits, just staring, locked onto mine. "Jake, come on," Emily shouted, breaking through the panic in my head. She was at the top of a small hill, waving her arms for me to hurry. I stumbled, my feet caught on a root, and for a moment, I thought I was done for. But then Emily was there, pulling me up, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to keep moving," she cried. I nodded, too scared to speak, and we kept going. The thing behind us let out a horrific noise, a mixture of a scream and a growl, angry, frustrated. It echoed through the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint where it was coming from. Felt like it was everywhere. We kept running, not caring about the direction, just trying to get away. My legs were shaky, my muscles screaming at me to stop, but I couldn't. I wouldn't. Emily was right there with me, her face set in a determined grimace, and I knew she felt the same terror, the kind that makes you feel like an animal trapped in a corner. We had to keep going. We had to find a way out. Suddenly, Emily grabbed my arm again, yanking me to the side. I almost protested, but then I saw it. A break in the trees, a narrow path, or maybe an old road. We stumbled toward it, our feet slipping on the loose gravel. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way out of this. But then I heard it again, that voice closer now, twisting and broken. "Jake, come here." I felt the panic surge again, my skin turning cold with fear. Emily's eyes were wide with the same terror I felt. We weren't safe, not even close. I don't know how long we kept running. Time felt like it had bent in on itself, minutes stretching into hours, or maybe it was the other way around. All I knew was that my legs were about to give out, and Emily's face was pale, a mix of exhaustion and raw fear. We stumbled along the road, slipping on the loose gravel, but at least it was something. A path leading somewhere other than deeper into the dark. And then we heard it again. The voice. This time, it was so close it felt like it was breathing down my neck. "Jake, Emily," it called, its words stretching unnaturally. I felt my heart racing, my body drenched in cold sweat. Every noise in the woods made me jump. But then, just as I thought I couldn't run any further, we saw it. A flicker of headlights through the trees, an engine rumbling, growing louder. I grabbed Emily's arm and dragged her towards the light. A truck, a dusty old pickup, was coming down the road. I waved my arms, shouting, "Stop, please." The truck screeched to a halt, gravel flying. The driver, a man with rough features and worry in his eyes, leaned out of the window, took one look at us, and jerked his thumb toward the back. "Get in!" he yelled, no questions asked. We didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled into the back, collapsing against the metal, struggling to breathe. Emily clung to me, shaking uncontrollably. The truck roared to life, speeding down the road. I dared glance back, scanning the dark edges of the woods, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the tree line was something that looked like Emily again, but its face, it was wrong, like a mask that didn't fit. And its eyes, those hollow, empty pits, locked onto mine. Then it smiled, twisted, sickening smile, and I swear I heard it say my name again, just barely audible over the roar of the truck's engine. The sound sent a chill through my bones. Emily buried her face against my shoulder, her voice trembling. "We made it. We're safe." But even as she said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't. Not really. The driver didn't say a word. His eyes were fixed on the road, his hands tight on the wheel. He knew, just like the locals had known. Some places weren't meant for people. Some things weren't meant to be seen. As the truck sped away, the forest grew smaller behind us. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The thing in the woods, the thing that wore Emily's face, was still out there. And something told me it wasn't done with us. I'll admit, I was more excited about this trip than anyone else. Jake had been begging for some time off work, Emma needed a break from her endless social media scrolling, and Greg, well, he wasn't exactly thrilled about leaving his video games behind. But for me, I thought it'd be a chance for all of us to reconnect. There's something about escaping the chaos of city life and sitting around a campfire that felt like it could fix the little cracks that had formed between USSO. We packed the car full and headed off to the mountains of Wyoming for what was supposed to be a relaxing escape. The campsite was perfect, maybe too perfect. It looked like something you'd see on the cover of a camping magazine. Tall pines lining a tranquil lake, the water as still as a mirror that I remember thinking, half-jokingly, that it was so serene, it had to be cursed in some way. I should have trusted that feeling. We set up camp, and surprisingly, everyone settled in well. Greg and Emma were even getting along, helping Jake with the tent while I gathered firewood. We roasted marshmallows and laughed at how clueless we were about camping. For a while, I let myself think maybe this trip would actually bring us closer, like the distance between us wasn't as bad as I'd feared. But then we heard it, the rustling in the woods. Jake brushed it off, saying it was probably just a deer. He had a way of acting like nothing ever fazed him. But Emma wasn't convinced. She stared into the trees, squinting as if trying to make sense of something. "Mom, I swear I saw something move," she whispered to me, her eyes wide as I tried to reassure her, though a chill was creeping up my spine. It's funny how, at that moment, I convinced myself that feeling was just my imagination. A deer, a raccoon, something normal. But as the sun set, there was an eerie stillness. Even the wind stopped. The camp became quiet, too quiet. The laughter faded, and that uneasy silence took its place. I kept glancing over my shoulder, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever Emma thought she'd seen. But it was just shadows moving between the trees. That night, we all crammed into the tent, zipping it up tight like that flimsy fabric would protect us from whatever was out there. It was supposed to be comforting, being together in our little nylon bubble. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I drifted off, a snap of a twig or the rustling of leaves would jolt me awake, my heart racing. Jake snored soundly beside me, unaware of anything. I envied him. Emma was curled up with her face buried in her sleeping bag, and Greg had his headphones in like he thought he could block out the entire forest. Me? I lay awake, staring at the dark fabric above me, listening to the noises outside. Hours seemed to drag by, each sound more unsettling than the last. Then it came again, the rustling, but closer that I held my breath, feeling the dread in my gut. Something was out there. I could feel its presence, its eyes fixed on our tent. Just waiting. I tried to stop my mind from spiraling. I closed my eyes and told myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in the woods. And whatever it wasn't just a deer. It wasn't going anywhere. By morning, I tried to push the fear aside. It was daylight after all. Things always seemed less frightening in the light. Jake, of course, acted like nothing had happened. He was already brewing coffee over the fire, like we hadn't spent half the night listening to something lurking around our tent. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked, and I gave him a look like, "Are you serious?" But I just smiled. No reason to make things worse. After breakfast, Jake suggested we take a hike. I wasn't sure. There was something about leaving the campsite that didn't sit right with me, like we'd be giving up our only safe space. But Emma and Greg were excited, and I didn't want to ruin it, so we followed a narrow trail deeper into the forest at first. It felt fun. Greg was making silly jokes, poking fun at Emma, who shoved him back. Jake pointed out different trees like he was an expert. I tried to relax, to just enjoy being with them. But the further we went, the quieter it got. The birds that had been singing earlier were gone. Even the breeze had stopped. The same heavy silence from last night slowly crept back in. About an hour in, we saw it. At first, I thought it was just a deer standing in the clearing ahead. But something wasn't right. Its legs were too long, and it was standing like a person. Jake stopped, his smile fading. "That's weird," he muttered, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Emma grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "Mom, that's what I saw last night," she whispered. I tried to reassure her, telling her it was just a deer, but the words stuck in my throat. The creature turned its head toward us, and I swear its eyes were wrong. Too big, too human. Jake stepped back, pulling Greg with him. "We should go," he said in a low voice. I didn't need to be told twice. We turned and started walking back slowly, trying to stay calm. But I could feel it watching us, and my instincts screamed to run. I wanted to, but I didn't want to provoke it. We started walking faster, then almost jogging when we heard it. A screech, high-pitched and unnatural, echoing through the trees. "Run!" Jake shouted, and we did. We bolted through the woods, branches whipping our faces as we raced back toward the camp. I grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her along, and I could hear Greg's frantic footsteps behind me. The forest felt like it was closing in on us. The trees blurred as we stumbled toward safety, and all the while, the screeching was getting closer. When we finally made it back to camp, I was out of breath, my chest burning. Jake was already at the tent, grabbing everything he could. His face was pale. "Get in the car," he yelled, and we didn't hesitate. We piled into the car, and Jake fumbled with the keys. His hands were shaking. I looked out the window, back at the tree line, and there it was, standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. Its skin seemed to ripple, like it was barely holding itself together. The car roared to life, and Jake floored it, kicking up dirt as we sped down the narrow road that I didn't look back. Couldn't. All I could do was hold Emma close, her sobs muffled against my shoulder, and pray that whatever that thing was, it wasn't following us as we drove. The silence came back. The kind that fills your ears and settles deep in your bones. The kind that told me this wasn't over. The ride to the ranger station was a blur. Jake drove like he was on a mission, his knuckles white on the wheel. I kept glancing back, expecting to see that creature chasing us, limbs twisted and all. Emma had stopped crying, her face pressed against my chest, and Greg stared straight ahead, his eyes wide, and no one spoke. What could we say? We all knew what we saw, and none of us knew if we were safe yet. When we finally reached the ranger station, Jake almost crashed into the gate. He slammed on the brakes, and we all sat there for a second, the silence weighing heavy. He finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Get out." We rushed toward the small building like it was our refuge. The ranger on duty was a young guy, maybe in his late 20s, holding a coffee cup. He looked up as we burst through the door, his eyes widening at the sight of us. Disheveled, terrified, and probably looking like we'd lost our minds. "Hey, what's going on?" he asked, putting down his coffee. Jake tried to explain, but the words tumbled out in a jumbled mess. "A deer, no, something wrong in the woods. It chased us." The ranger gave us a skeptical look, making my nerves worse. "Ma'am, are you saying you saw a deer?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake him until he understood. But instead, I nodded, my hands shaking. "It wasn't a deer," I whispered. "It had human eyes." For a second, the ranger's expression changed. Maybe fear? Maybe recognition? He cleared his throat and stood up, motioning for us to sit. "All right, stay here. I'm going to make a call." His voice wasn't as casual anymore. He walked into the back, and I could hear him talking. His words muffled. Jake slumped into a chair, his head in his hands, and Greg finally seemed to snap out of his daze. "Mom, what was that?" He whispered that I didn't have an answer. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? "I don't know, sweetheart," I said, pulling him close. "But we're safe now. We're safe." I wasn't sure if I believed it. The ranger came back, his face pale. He avoided looking at us. "I've got someone coming," he said, his voice tight. "Just stay here, okay? Don't go anywhere." At that moment, I knew. Whatever we had seen, it wasn't new. It wasn't unheard of. And that scared me more than anything, because if the ranger knew about it, if he had a plan, it meant it had happened before. And it could happen again. We spent the night in a small motel. The four of us crammed into one room. No one slept. We kept the lights on and the curtains closed. Every so often, I'd peek out, half expecting to see those eyes staring back at me. Jake sat by the door, a chair wedged under the handle. Like that would keep whatever it was out to be. Why morning, we were gone. Packed up and out of there before the sun came up. None of us spoke as we drove away from Wyoming, the forest fading in the distance behind us. But I knew we'd never truly leave it behind. Not the memory, not the feeling of those eyes watching us. The kind of feeling that sinks into your bones and never leaves, no matter how far you run. And as we crossed the state line, I found myself glancing back one last time. The trees blurred in the rearview mirror. I knew we'd never go back. Be careful out there. I knew that taking the job near the Appalachian Mountains would be lonely, but I never expected it to be this quiet. My first week at the fire lookout tower was almost peaceful. I woke up every morning to a crisp, cold sunrise, with trees stretching endlessly into the horizon. A green sea broken only by the occasional rustling of wind and the chirps of birds. The isolation was exactly what I signed up for, but it was during the first few nights that things started to change. The radio was an old, outdated model, crackling with static in the background whenever it was on. At first, it was nothing more than that harmless noise, but after a few nights, I started hearing something underneath it. Faint whispers. They were so soft, I thought it was just the wind. I ignored it. After all, it was probably just the equipment acting up. This place wasn't exactly modern. But then the whispers changed. They didn't sound like static anymore. It was as though several people were trying to speak, their voices distant and weak. I would lie in bed, staring at the radio across the room, trying to make sense of it. It only ever happened late at night, always when I was alone in the dark. I told myself it was nothing, but the sound sent chills up my spine. A few nights later, the whispers became cries. Pleas for help. They were soft, almost desperate, like someone was lost and calling for assistance. The calls seemed to come from deep in the forest, from places I knew no one could possibly be. I checked the maps, tracing the origin of the voices to dead-end canyons and old, forgotten trails, areas where no hiker should be wandering, especially not at midnight. I told myself it had to be some kind of prank, maybe someone messing with the frequency. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, the radio crackled louder than before. I heard a voice, my voice, calling out for help. It was desperate and terrified. "Help me, please," it begged, and I swear my heart stopped. It wasn't just similar to my voice. It was my voice. I felt frozen, my eyes locked on the radio as it crackled again before falling silent. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The wind stopped, and all the usual nighttime sounds vanished. I was alone, yet I wasn't. Something was out there. I rushed to the window, staring out at the forest, bathed in pale moonlight. First, everything seemed still. Then something moved, a shadow at the edge of the clearing. My heart raced as I strained to see, and slowly, a figure emerged from the trees, making its way toward the base of the tower. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The way it moved wasn't right. Its limbs jerked, like they didn't fit together, and then I saw its face. It was my face, twisted, hollow-eyed, with a grotesque, unnatural smile. It looked up at me, and I swear it knew I was watching. It started climbing the stairs, each step echoing louder and louder. My radio crackled again, my voice begging for help. I felt a scream rise in my throat, but no sound came out. My flashlight was in my hand before I even realized it, the beam flickering as I pointed it toward the stairs. The figure didn't stop, kept coming, the smile never faltering. Panic took over, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran to the opposite side of the tower, and without thinking, I jumped. The branches below caught me, scratching and tearing at my skin as I tumbled down the slope. I didn't care about the pain. I just knew I had to get away. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't me, and it wanted something I wasn't willing to give. I don't know how I survived that jump. I woke up at the bottom of the hill, bruised and aching, my head pounding, my body feeling like it had been dragged through a thorn bush. It was still dark, with only the moon overhead casting long shadows through the trees. For a moment, I thought maybe it had all been a nightmare. But then I heard it, the radio crackling from the tower, my own voice echoing out into the night, still calling for help. I knew I couldn't stay there. I forced myself to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me. I had to get as far away from that tower as possible. I started moving, half running, half stumbling through the woods. Every branch that snapped underfoot made me jump. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The forest felt different now. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way the shadows seemed to move, shifting just out of the corner of my eye, as if something was watching me. I had no idea where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks tripping me up as I ran. My flashlight was barely working, the beam flickering in and out, but I didn't dare stop to fix it. I could still hear the radio, faint now, but my own voice was still calling my name, pleading for help. It made my skin crawl. After what felt like hours, I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree. My lungs were burning, my legs ready to give out at any moment. I listened, trying to hear anything over the sound of my breathing. The forest was silent, too silent. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer. My heart skipped a beat. It was here, the thing that looked like me. I turned off my flashlight, hoping the darkness would hide me, pressing myself against the tree, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps grew louder, the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs. Each step echoed in the stillness. I saw it then, a shadow moving through the trees. Its head turned slowly from side to side, like it was searching for something, searching for me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was too scared. I watched as the figure came closer, the moonlight catching its face. My face, but its eyes were empty, like black holes. The smile twisted wider, stretching too far, like it was enjoying my fear. It stopped, tilting its head slightly as if it was listening. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it wouldn't find me. Then suddenly it turned and began walking away, back into the woods. I waited, trembling, until I could no longer hear its footsteps. I didn't know why it had left, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I forced myself to move, every muscle aching, and started running again, deeper into the forest. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than here. The whispers started again, faint at first, then growing louder. They were all around me, echoing through the trees. My own voice was calling my name over and over. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. It was like the forest itself was speaking, trying to draw me in, trying to make me stop. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I didn't stop running until I saw the flicker of a campfire in the distance. I stumbled toward it, my legs barely holding me up. A group of hikers looked up in shock as I burst into their camp, their faces filled with confusion. I must have looked like a madman, covered in dirt and scratches, my eyes wide with fear. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. They didn't need to understand. They could see the terror in my eyes. They let me stay by the fire, and for the first time that night, I felt a small sense of safety. Sitting by the fire with the hikers felt like the first breath of fresh air after being underwater too long. The warmth of the flames chased away some of the chill that had settled into my bones. The hikers asked questions, who I was, where I had come from, but I could barely get the words out. All I could do was mutter about the tower, about the voice that wasn't mine. They exchanged uneasy glances but let me stay. It was enough to feel a little less alone. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows around the clearing. I tried to tell myself I was safe now, that whatever had been following me couldn't come this far. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The forest felt alive, like it was listening, watching, and the shadows beyond the fire seemed to shift on their own. I couldn't sleep, even though the other hikers eventually lay down, exhausted. My body was sore and aching, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. Every rustle of the leaves, every crackle of the fire made me jump. My eyes kept drifting to the edge of the clearing, expecting to see that figure again, my face smiling that horrible smile. I tried to keep my eyes on the fire, tried to focus on the warmth, the light, but I could feel the forest pressing in on me. Then I heard it again. My voice, faint but clear, coming from somewhere in the darkness. "Help me, please." My stomach twisted, and I felt the warmth drain from my body. It was the same words, the same tone, like a broken record, repeating over and over. I turned to look at the hikers, but they were all asleep, oblivious. I was alone again with the voice. I stood up, my heart pounding. The voice grew louder, echoing through the trees, coming from all directions, surrounding me. My own voice pleading, desperate. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over one of the sleeping hikers. I wanted to wake them, to make them hear it too, but something stopped me. A sense of dread, like if I acknowledged it, if I said it out loud, it would make everything worse. The voice grew louder still, until it was almost deafening. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. It was inside my head, rattling around like a trapped insect. I backed away from the campfire, my eyes darting around the clearing, searching for the source. Then, at the edge of the firelight, I saw it, the figure, my face, twisted and wrong, staring at me from the shadows. His mouth moved, and the words came out. My words. "Help me, please." It stepped closer, and I could see the emptiness in its eyes, the smile widening, stretching too far. It was enjoying my fear. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I turned and ran, sprinting past the sleeping hikers, away from the campfire, deeper into the forest. Branches whipped at my face, the underbrush clawing at my legs, but I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me. The footsteps, the voice still calling my name, still pleading for help. The forest closed in around me, the darkness swallowing me whole. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the forest floor, my chest heaving. The whispers were all around me now, my own voice mixed with others, a chorus of desperate pleas. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face, and prayed for it to stop. Suddenly, a hand touched my shoulder. I gasped, jerking away, but it was one of the hikers, his face filled with concern. "Hey, it's okay," he said, his voice breaking through the noise in my head. "You're safe now." I looked around, realizing I was back at the camp. The other hikers were awake, their faces worried, the fire still crackling nearby. But as I looked past them into the dark forest, I knew it wasn't over. The shadows were still there, shifting, waiting, and somewhere out there, my own voice was still calling, still begging for help. And I knew deep down that it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted.